Well, thanks so much for coming. I know it's the worst timing ever, but thanks that you could squeeze it in. So I think we start going, and we get going, and then maybe in 20 minutes we see the food. Take a food break. Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about ICT for development. That's the topic I did most of my work, and let's say my hands-on and my research work at the United Nations. That's still what I do. And I also designed a master levels course on that now for USC, so I could surely talk about that for days. What I try to do in this presentation, I try to squeeze in some conceptual things, because I think one of the biggest problems we have in that community, also if you go to all the conferences, is that we don't have enough concepts. We certainly don't have a model. I'm also far from having a model, in a sense, something that's dynamic and can predict. But we have some concepts and some theories, and so maybe I want to go back on that, and I try to cram some of that into this presentation, some of recent papers that I wrote. But first of all, I think the most important thing that we always have to remember is this question: what is more important for the poor than ICT? And you all,
Development.
Development, yes, surely. And how do you define development?
Well-being, happiness.
Very good. Development is freedom, as Amartya Sen said, right? The deprivation of capabilities. And yeah, so development is the opposite of poverty. And what is poverty? It's the absence of development. And that can be any kind of... In the UN, the bureaucrats and diplomats picked 4 indicators that the UNDP is measuring: income, to education, literacy and schooling, and health, longevity. There's no indicator for democratic participation or freedom in there, because some countries didn't want to have it in there. But of course, development can be broadly defined. And ICT is surely, there are many things that are more important than ICT, right? Food, safety, democratic freedoms, and so forth. So ICT is actually one of the least important things in this sense, but ICT is an enabler. Right? And that's important to remember, that it's not, we don't do ICT in order to do ICT. And that's where the theory starts. So I want to go through the theoretical framework that shows us, there's a long history, a big body of literature that tells us how technologies are enablers for social change. Then we go a little bit into digital divide or digital development, which are 2 sides of the same coin, same as development and poverty, right? So, which you can conceptualize with which attribute connects how to what. We will talk a little bit about digital innovations and applications, and at the end, hopefully I have time to go into policy strategy. So these are the things I want to talk about. So let's say we start with this. That's the theoretical framework I use. They call it broadly innovation theory. It comes from economists like Schumpeter, not mainstream economists, people that say that the economy is out of equilibrium, far from equilibrium always. And they basically say that progress comes from some enabling technology, general purpose technologies. They have to have certain characteristics to be classified as such, that lead to far-reaching social and economic and political change. The ICT is not, it's maybe the most recent one, but not the first one. I mean, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, all of that comes from the same logic. That's how we classify human progress. And if some aliens would come down to us, we would classify their progress on the basis of their technologies. Probably, right? They would have some things where they embed their knowledge in a physical structure. That's what technology is. And we would classify them according to that. Now, that is progress. It doesn't make development, of course. But so ICT is the latest one, the most recent one, but surely not the last one. We actually overdo for the next one. Probably the molecular age, gene, bio, or a new form of energy or whatever. But we are long overdue for the next one. But ICT is the current one. And we as communication scholars have the privilege or the curse to shape this very also dramatic changes. Schumpeter called this creative destruction. It's a brutal process. It destroys and creates anew and is socially constructed anew. Right? So this is a little bit the theoretical framework I derive from. Is a huge body of literature there. And it always goes, there's an enabling technology that leads to social change. Now, starting from this, I talked about that a little bit 2 days ago. I don't know if some of you made it to the other talk. You can basically conceptualize this entire subject as an interplay between technology. On the first hand, there you have basically what I always say, everything you can touch and everything you cannot touch. So you have all the mobile phones and the internet connections. And here you have the softwares and the Facebooks and the Twitters and whatever generic services you use to apply that, then you have human capabilities that make use, that socially embed this technology into social practices, and with this you digitize different sectors of society. So you put part of the information and communication flow in these sectors of social activity into electronic networks. That's where you put the E in front, which is just a temporary thing we used to do, and that is of course open-ended here. There's e-dating and e-banking and e-monitoring of malnutrition. And one of my students wrote about ICT and domestic violence. You know, there's a lot of applications we can use ICT for. So this is the necessary but not the sufficient. As I said, these technologies are socially constructed, so we need policy strategies here, public policy and private strategy that socially construct these technologies. And policies, we have basically two kinds in a broad systems theoretic sense. We have positive and negative feedback. So either we put more oil into the fire or we put water into the fire. We want to incentivize something that's going on, or we want to tune down something that we don't like. So, and that's how we shape this progress into development, whatever we want to aim for normatively as being development, right? So this is basically, and this cube then basically you can call this your development of ICT, right? This here is ICT for development, and this here is, well, enabling sectors, the social embeddedness, and here are the policy instruments, right? So you have development of the technologies, and many people focus on that, the digital divide, software, hardware industry, the new $100 laptop or whatever you want to develop, some new software that you develop, that's development of ICT, and the other one is ICT for development when you have the social change. So that is to be distinguished. Now, if you take the cube, one of the nicest things with the cube is you can play around with it a little bit. So I use that to structure some books of mine, to structure conferences. Policymakers love it because usually these conferences go by so quickly that some says, oh no, this is important, and then no, education is important. Oh, well, no, and e-government is important. No, what, privacy is the most important. No, and the digital divide is, and you go in circles all day long, and with this cube you can kind of like at least say, well, all is important, it all intersects. And also if you use it as a research tool, you can kind of like focus in on something. For example, you have here incentives, positive feedback for infrastructure development and e-government, right? So the intersection of these three would be here in the back of the cube, and you could study incentives for connectivities for municipalities. I did an entire study of that with 300 municipalities. It was very interesting, and you focus just on something very discrete. So you can play around with this cube a little bit and identify and also see how things are connected. Right, so for example, I don't know, some regulation could be cross-cutting through all the sectors, privacy, for example, and you could just analyze how that goes together. Now let's focus on some dimension, and that is the first one, and I want to focus on that a lot because I did a lot of work on this, and that's the idea of the digital divide, which is basically inequality in the digital age, inequality in the communication, in the realm of communication. The digital divide is a fancy name, but what it basically is, it's a part of a very old theory. That's the theory of the diffusion of innovation through social networks. Here's Everett Rogers, that maybe many of you, at least at Annenberg, and Annenberg you of course know Elio Katz, who we have the big honor of having here, who was one of the pioneers in this work of the diffusion of innovation. How does the diffusion, well, or Everett Rogers always studied the fertilizers, the spread of fertilizers in the farmers of Idaho. And the digital divide is the same thing, it's just something spreads. In this case, it is communication technology itself. It's the innovation that spreads. And there are different stages. There's the early innovators, then there's the adapters, and then there's the new innovators. And it's a contagion process. It's the same mathematically as a virus spreads through social networks. So this is actually a social network thing. I love social networks. They're very interesting in order to understand how society works. So an innovation comes in here somehow and spreads through this social network. It comes in several parts and spreads through the social network, right, until everybody eventually is connected or not. Maybe some pockets will never be connected. Maybe there's some structures, there's some clusters, which we do not get into. Maybe there is kind of like a systematic bias in the spread of the innovation, but that's actually how innovation spread, through social networks. Let's remember, I wanted to show you really quickly, just to remind you, probably many of you know that, the basics of this diffusion of innovation. So I take a very, very simple network here, that's it, we call it a grid. It's a homogeneous network. It's just like completely even. There is no interesting structure in it. So let's start with this, a very even network. And let's see, say, we have at the beginning 2 innovators, right? These 2 guys are the first ones who adopt. They have an adoption rate of 1%, and we still have, in total, we have 100 people in our network, and we still have 98 people non-connected, right? So let's start like this. So this is the basis of the diffusion of innovation. We have then that these 2 people have a contagion rate, say spreading rate of 1% on these 98 that are still not adopted, so they infect 2 new adopters in this present stage. So the innovation spreads from these 2 to 2 more. So I already have here around 4 adopters. Now these 4 adopters again spread with the same, for reason of simplicity, constant adoption rate, 1%. The 96 that are left, so they contage 4 new people with these innovation. So in total now, in the next round, we have about 8. Again, constant adoption rate, they contage 7 new people. Correct? So that's how it goes on, basically. And you have a contagion of the entire society. Through that, what you get as a result, you have you can measure the numbers of new adopters, you get average Rogers, perfectly nice unimodal curve, or you can have the cumulative number of adopters, which is a logistic curve, which is this blue stuff here, right? So I can either measure this from 0 to 100, or I can measure this, and it goes up and down. So this is the diffusion of innovations through social networks in a very, very, very simplistic theory. Now, of course, the social network in reality has intricate structure, so it's never a grid. So that's why all these diffusion curves look a little different, right? This here is the refrigerator. This is the radio here. This is the fixed line phone. This is VCR, this is color television, cell phone, computer, internet. And all these diffusion curves, they look kind of like S-shaped curve, so the theory is pretty solid. And when they look a little different, we can also look where it comes from. It usually comes from the structure of this network and, well, on the if there's a certain threshold, if people adopt it or not. But it's the same old theory. I just went into this theory, and the basic tendency is that the innovation always diffuses quicker because the network is always more connected, right? And there are certain attributes of the network. So you see that these S-shaped diffusion curves get ever steeper over the last 150 years. Doesn't change that it's still the same theory. So, and often if you read the digital divide literature, people just think, oh, this new phenomena, this new thing of inequality, but it's still, we can use this old theory, old and very valid theory, in order to understand it. So I wanted to make clear, I spent these 5 minutes to show you that it's exactly the same stuff that we understand very, very well, especially here in the School of Communication, and especially on this one here. So how to define the digital divide analytically based on this framework, and I wanted to also talk about who defines the digital divide in practice at the end, and these are 2 different questions that the literature is grappling with. How to define it analytically is I start with my network, right? So we go by the old theory of diffusion of innovation. This is my network here. I have different nodes with ties, and somehow the innovation diffused already through that, and when I take my inventory, I somehow have a divide between the blue ones and the not blue ones. All the blue ones are the haves, and all the not blue ones are the haves-nots, right? And then I say, okay, right now I have a divide. And that's how my network looks at this present moment. So that's basically it. Now the question is, okay, how can you go about this? What are the alternatives you have to define that? Well, first of all, I can say, what makes this line? What makes a dot blue and what makes it white? What does it mean that you are have or have not? Do you have a phone? Do you have an internet? Do you have television? Do you have broadband? Do you have mobile broadband? What does it make that I say you are on this side of the divide, not on that side, right? Second of all, I can have, who is the node? Well, that's arbitrarily defined by the modeler, by the researcher. The node can be a country, it can be an individual, it can be a school, it can be a hospital, it can be a company, it can be whatever you want to, networks of what do you want to model, right? Then there are, which attributes do I follow? Which attributes do I register for with each of the nodes? So an individual, if I say, okay, my nodes are individuals, do I track, does it matter if they're man or woman? Or I don't even track that. Does it matter if they're rich or poor, if they're educated or not, if they're urban or rural? Or often this question comes in. But these are just attributes of nodes if you go through network theory. So network theory is very important here, right? You usually network theory have your two databases, the one that has the attributes of the nodes and the other one that has the ties, the matrix. So this just defines the one database, the attributes of the nodes. And then at the end, I can also say, well, how do they connect? So even if I have internet access, is it enough to have internet access? Or do I have to use it? Do I have to use it once a week? Or an hour a week? Do I have to make transaction, or is it enough if I have a look at it? Do I have to use a keyboard, or is it enough to have a phone? Or do I have to actually make transaction and have impact with it, and then the digital divide is closed? I mean, how do people use it? So that can also be defined differently, and the literature defines it differently. So let's start with that. What kind of technologies? Well, usually you find here these indicators, fixed line phone, mobile phones, internet, broadband, and whatever you want to measure. That's the indicators we know. The ITU and all the governments give us the data about that, and that's easy to find. Now the problem is, okay, so which one really does matter? Is the digital divide closed when we all have mobile phones? 90% of humankind now is mobile phones. We have more mobile phone penetration than electricity penetration. Electricity is at 85. We have 90% penetration mobile phones. So does it mean that the digital divide is closed? Or do we need broadband? Broadband what, fixed or mobile? Or is it internet, is that enough? So what then basically researchers did, they came up with these indexes. So I have mobile phones, I have fixed line, I have broadband, I have computers. I create an index, I weigh each of them arbitrarily, I define a weight to them, and I say mobile phones count 20%, fixed line counts 20%, and then I rank all the countries in the world and say they are the most connected. Now the other researcher who's financed by a mobile phone operator says, no, I weigh mobile phones 80% and fixed line broadband only 20%, and the entire ranking goes upside down. So there's the question, okay, what does it mean to be connected? What I argue, what is useful, what does it mean to be connected? I don't care about the numbers of subscriptions, I also care about the capacity. So I don't care about which technology you use, as long as I know in this country we have 20 kilobits per person. Or in this country we have 1 megabits per second per person. And that is an indicator that this 1 megabit you can accumulate through fixed line, through broadband, through whatever. You can use it many times or short times, and I can then study that, but at the end an indicator that harmonizes all of that is simply saying I take the bandwidth, and we have then a kind of like two-part divide. I have here the numbers of devices, and we see that kind of like hits a wall at 2 devices per capita. In a sense, you have a fixed device and a mobile device, and that seems to be what you need. And then it kind of like goes up, and there seems to be no, the sky is the limit, right? There seems to be no end in sight. So how many kilobits per person is enough? I think Bill Gates said once that 100 kilo is plenty for everybody, right? He said that 20 years ago, and now we already have 10 mega here in all of our households. So there seems to be, and so the digital divide seems to move to this side first. The big countries are the rich countries, the small circles are poor countries. It goes, obviously they go first, so it goes to this side, and then it goes upwards. So that's kind of like the nature of the divide. And this divide is continuously ongoing, right? So it's continuous to open up, actually, in many respects. The bits per capita divide is still widening, while the numbers of devices are converging. Like everybody has a mobile phone now. There's nothing interesting to measure there anymore, right? The real divide is how much communication capacity do you have. And the United Nations is also starting to recognize that. In the recent report, they used my data a lot, and they were calling for we have to start measuring bandwidth, and they made a call to the countries, to the FCCs of the world, to the telecom regulators, to start measuring bandwidth. We don't measure that yet, so we don't really have an idea about this bandwidth divide, which is very solid. So the second question is then, who is my subject of study? So that is what kind of technology, right, do I track when I measure the digital divide? I would say measure the bit rate. That is a very solid indicator. Because it doesn't matter the device. Now we have iPads, now everybody is talking. It doesn't really matter what you use, just measure the bandwidth, And with that, then we can do the interesting stuff, and that's the impact, the social impact. Now, the second is, so who is the subject of my social network? Well, as always, a social network is always a model. I abstract reality. I can use individuals. In the form I showed you, countries. Countries were the subject, right? Where it spread through. Here, I did a study on municipalities. We see that the technology was email, not bandwidth. And we see that in a couple of Latin American countries, how the innovation of email spread through the social network of municipalities, right? You see big jumps in some countries. And now the subject can be whatever you choose. It can be hospitals, companies, municipalities, individuals, right? That's just a modeling decision. The next one is, which are the attributes of the nodes? So, let's say municipalities, it would be interesting, are they big or small? Are they rural or urban? In a social network analysis, obviously, that is the same as in all statistical analysis. I have to see, well, what attributes do I want to track? What attributes have the most impact, right? If I have people, I can measure their size, how tall they are. Maybe it won't tell me a lot, but I can measure other indicators that matter. And the question is, which ones are the ones that matter for the digital divide? That are interesting to predict how this innovation diffuses. Well, the one that first comes to mind is, of course, income. The social network, the innovation seems to spread to those nodes first that have higher income, right? Because they can buy them. So let's look at the income divide. And the income divide is something that's very much studied and is in the focus a lot of attention of the literature. For example, if you think about the $100 laptop, right? The one laptop per child. Big idea from Nicolas Negroponte. Went, of course, wrong in many ways, as we know. But just this notion of $100 laptop. And his idea, he wants one laptop per child. It already shows you, well, is a $100 laptop really going to work for one laptop per child? And for that, you basically have to sit down and see, well, how much money do the poor have? Is $100 cheap enough to get a laptop to every child? So I once sat down and did this calculation. And what you get is, for example, if you take the data of Mexico, on average in Mexico, people spend $143 per person per year on ICT. The rich people spend $370 per year on ICT, the richest 20%, and the poorest 20% spend $35 per year on ICT. That is $3 per month that they spend on ICT. That means per day, 30 days, right? That's how much they can spend, exactly 10 cents. So if you want to have one laptop per child, at least you need to get it down to $35 a year, and then you don't even have connectivity for this laptop. You just have a laptop. So if you want to have traffic, you need to bring the traffic prices down to exactly something less than that, and with that you still have to buy the laptop, right? You can calculate for different countries, and that's what I did here. And then I also calculated, okay, so how much does ICT actually cost in Mexico in that year 2007? If you take a general package of a couple of minutes of mobile telephony and average mobile telecom operators have kind of like an ICT basket, a basic consumer basket, it costed around $307. And interestingly enough, the fixed line internet penetration of Mexico in that year was exactly around here at 15 or 20%, right? That means only the top 20% could actually afford that, and that's exactly how far the innovation spread. Obviously, that's just like regression, right? There was surely somebody here used the internet, but in general, you can see a very high correlation between the income structure of a society and where the innovation goes. So, and you can see that here basically, okay, so what is the alternative? What do we have? How can we bring the technology to these people? Well, first of all, we have to reduce the prices from $300 to $30. That means you have to cut current prices by 10. Don't tell that to anybody, especially not Apple. They're doing so well right now. Don't think they want to cut their income by 10. But then, the $100 laptop has to cost $10. Then we can have one laptop per child. I mean, it's a paradox to say $100 laptop, one laptop per child, because this money is not there, right? Just come back in a second. The other alternative would be to say, oh no, the state has to come in. Obviously, no, we have to subsidize that. We have to have public access and whatever, and the state is subsidized. If you want to bring individual technology to all these people, you would have to, in Mexico, have to spend as much money as Mexico right now is spending in public health and education together. around 6% of GDP. So this money, let's say $270 per person, per of these poor people, will cost around 6% of GDP. The government doesn't have this money. You go to the finance minister and say, hey, let's connect Mexico. I just need 6% of your GDP. He says, for what? For computers? You know, cannot even pay his teachers. So it's so both of them are, of course, technology cannot get as cheap, and we cannot subsidize. We have to find solutions in the middle. For example, bring, of course, the cost of technology down. And in Mexico, of course, you have a big problem of monopoly, and we can bring the costs much more down. And on the same hand as well, do subsidies, because the private sector will never care for these people. It is just not viable to have a connection at this point. Well, that was 2007. Now it also changed. But the only viable option for these people to have broadband access might be a public access option. Just like for these people, they use public transportation. They don't have the money for a car. So we set up the public transportation system. And in the digital age, we might have to set up public information systems, right? And if they pay 50 cents per session, 1 or 2 hour session broadband, then they can go 6 times a month to the public access center. Look for work, look for health issues, communicate with the government, and that might be the only option they have with this amount of money, right? So it's a mix of both. Yes, I think you had a question first. Is it still valid? Go ahead.
So I'm just wondering about sort of fair comparison. Is the $35 and everything moving that way, including the purchase of the cell phone or other kinds of things? And then also, given what you suggested about the costs per government, wouldn't there be significant benefits to Apple selling that many more computers to people?
Yeah.
If they can make that work, yes, there might be. And first of all, this is not. I just calculated that from the money that's available. So this one I calculated on ICT prices. This is just the income structure that's available. I don't think that changed a lot.
So it's not what they're actually spending?
No,
Okay.
I don't have these data. I just say I know that poor people spend this percentage on ICT, and that's how. So and I know that's how much money they have. So that's how I calculate that, right? So it's really what they earn, which didn't probably change a lot in the last 5 years. So I would guess it's still kind of like the same. They still have $35. This year has changed, surely, and hopefully went down as ICT spreads this way. Now, there are very good alternatives, and the best what Nicola Ponte did with this $100 laptop, he started the discussion. He kicked the stone, right? And boom, and it started in India right now. They have a $10 tablet, and they're pushing for that. Now, $10 tablet, now we're getting in the ballpark. Why can India do that? Well, they have many people. They go by scale, right? So if they really provide a $10 laptop and the government buys it in and provides it for all the students, now you have a scale and can say, okay, let's start producing that stuff. And there might be solutions, hopefully. I'm very hopeful that there might be solutions. Now, a $10 tablet doesn't give me broadband access because that still has to be financed. And then how much broadband can you do on a tablet if you know? So still, it might probably, hopefully be a mix where we always provide public access to top-notch connectivity, and we don't have first-class, second-class digital citizens, so they can only also do that, but public access probably, same as we do with transport. And then also hopefully have little connectivity that goes, also individual connectivity that goes further down the road. And there are good alternatives, they're good, and the market has to decide, right? And in economics, we call this here the market gap, the market inefficiency. How much can we push the market down here? And this we call really the access gap. It's economics terminology. That just means access gap means the market doesn't care about them. There are no viable solutions for them right now. They will not go there. They will not go to every village in the Amazon and connect it. It's just not, they have to make money, so they won't. So there we have to go, if we want to have a social state, to go in and connect them. Or we can just say, bad luck, you live in the Amazon.
So I guess I had 2 questions. One was very similar to hers, which was what about economies of scale? And I mean, are you sure really the market does not care about reaching like 1/4 of the world, which is in the developing countries, which are poor? At least from what little I have seen of the industry, they really do want to make it cheap. Secondly, hardware and software, by the very nature of their being hardware, Moore's law, right? Like it gets cheaper and cheaper to produce the same amount. So it is getting cheaper, and the market does care about making it cheaper.
Right.
And about scaling this up, because for them, even if it is $10 per person, but if it's 1 billion people, they earn a lot more than if they sell a $1,000 iPad for 10 people.
Right. two things. I do agree absolutely that obviously, hopefully, the bottom of the pyramid, and there's a lot of talk about we have to go to the bottom of the pyramid. The microfinance was a genius example, got the Nobel Prize, perfect example. And now the private sector still doesn't pick it up. He's still with some NGOs.
It is.
It's starting, but it's not easy. Let's say the most successful ones are still NGOs that do microfinance, right?
Yes, but at least in India, they're trying to privatize it and regulate it as a banking industry.
Right.
And
If that would work, perfect. The funny thing is still, if you look at the money, so they do care, and there is a niche, and I completely agree, and that's the hope, that we bring the market this far down. However, still, if you look at these countries, the data just show, in Latin America, for example, if I connect 20% of the people, I have 80% of the economic power. I reached 80%. That's just how the inequality works. Mm-hmm. So for me, as Apple going into a new country, let's say, I don't know, Peru, for me, I connect the first 20%. I have 80% of the richness at hand, and the rest, I say, the rest 20%. It's like the marginal returns of my investment go so far down that I just say, I sell iPhone 3 to the first 20%. I sell them iPhone 4. I sell them iPhone 5, and they are like up to date. I have 80% of the richness of the country, and the rest, like, really. And there we need social policy. Might be that we invent things, but it's not that you make more money with connecting the poor. You don't make more money. But you make some money, and that might still be viable. And that is a big hope, that we find solutions where we can connect them. Now, still, and the technology also gets cheaper, to get to your Musler argument. Absolutely, it gets cheaper, and now everybody has mobile phones. It's a good thing, and that opens the opportunity for millions for the first time. And it's a great opportunity. We should work on it. But this thing is still moving. They call it the Red Queen effect. You might be now connected. In absolute terms, you're better, but in relative terms, you're falling behind. So the inequality, the technological frontier is moving so quickly that we say, okay, now we give everybody 10 megabits. And then the rest already has 100 megabits, right? And then we give everybody 100 kilo, and they already have a setter. It's like, so that's why I said before, measure bandwidth, and you can see that the inequality, they call it the Red Queen, right? Even so, both are advancing. In relative terms, we get worse. So, and then you have to ask about, okay, you can say, I don't care. I just care about these people being better. Or I can say, I don't think that globally increasing inequality is a good thing, right? So you have these two things. And even so, yeah, this technology gets cheaper, but they get cheaper much slower than the technological frontier pushes them relatively behind. So.
Yeah. And coming to that, wasn't there a similar widening of the gap in mobile phones before it started what you're calling closing? As in, there was a period when, even though the developing countries were adopting mobile phones and whatever, they did not adopt it at the rate at which the developed countries had. And so it looked like the gap was widening. Similarly, very similar to the way.
Widening.
Sure. And also, what you're making is a quality versus quantity argument, right? Not the number of connections, but the quality of the connections. Bitrate is essentially a quality of the connection kind of an argument. That is still true even in mobile phones. While you seem to make the argument that mobile phones, we have closed the gap, but connectivity, we have not closed the gap.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah, but that's not really true. Is that like we have, most of the smartphones in the world are in the developed world, even today.
Yeah, I'm saying in number of mobile phones devices, we close the gap. In number of mobile phones communication capacity, no, it's widening. Yes.
So why are we making like a quantity but not quality argument for mobile phones, but we're making a quality but not quantity argument for connectivity?
No, I include mobile phones in my connectivity. The graph that I showed you, I throw everything in. I throw mobile phone connectivity and fixed line connectivity and whatever connectivity you can get. I don't care. And I make the same argument that I say in mobile phones. I have it divided between mobile phones, mobile connectivity and fixed connectivity, and I have them together. I can analyze them separately or not. But what I can also show in mobile connectivity, yes, there is a divide. It's actually, if we look at the numbers, it's not really increasing right now, but there's no monotonic tendency. It's opening, widening with every new innovation, right? Also in mobile capacity. And I completely agree with you. I'm the only one who makes this argument right now, but it seems like many people got excited about it, and they want to measure bandwidth. Now, it's not easy to measure bandwidth because there are a lot of tricks, and we don't have the data, and we're not doing it yet, but people got excited about it, and hopefully we'll do that. And then we will see that, yes, is it widening, is it closing? And it will always go on. And when everybody has a 4G iPhone, some will have little holograms on their hands, and some, it will always continue, so it's not like it's a moving target. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to make an argument that it is the nature of how the world works, that there is a widening gap. The rich get richer because most of it is capitalist, and so it happens. But so it's not really a function of development or lack of it. It's a function of partly how the markets work. And
yeah, sure. But if I do development policy, I have to understand how the market works, and that's how it is. Sometimes the market saturates, and that was the big hope of many, that the market is saturated. The mobile phones, everybody has it. We can all go home, and you read reports. You read right now reports from ITU, from UNCTAD, from many governments. They publish reports and say, digital divide is closing. We can all go home. Everybody has mobile phones. That's what they say, because they don't measure capacity. They just measure the number of devices. They pat each other on the back. Our liberalization policies really worked. We got a great competition. Everybody has mobile phones. I think we can close this chapter, and it's good. But let's move on to something more where we still have inequality. They don't get it. They don't even measure it. And open up. There are all the reports. That's what they say.
so are you advocating then that we have a more socialist kind of a world where the government plays a bigger role in providing public access, public ICTs?
No, I think it has to be a combination between both. It has to be obviously a combination. The market can do many things, and it can go very deep. And also we know from economic theory there's always some exclusion. We always have to say there are some that the market is not interesting to connect them, or they connect them with a second and third class solution, right? And then we have to see, do we want to include them or not? In Europe, they connect them a lot. They have big social systems. Here, maybe not. Or maybe we should. In Europe, if you are under the poverty line and you have a child, they give you broadband access. The government provides it to you. So that is part of the food stamps, you might call them here, right? So this became it becomes a public good. Communication capacity became a public. Here, that's what every government has to decide of the governance form, if you want to have social systems or not. Right? Or if you say, okay, if we don't have social systems, we get rid of the food stamps and, of course, of anything else, but that's the form of government you have. And that will also affect the diffusion of the innovation, right? Mm-hmm.
Why don't you finish and come back at the end?
Okay, good. So, yes, before we go to lunch, so, of course, there are now the income argument, and here I have the income. So, of course, with higher income, I find more connectivity. These are mobile phones, for example, in Brazil. Now, independently, also there are many other indicators who impact that. For example, education. So, independently of the level of income, these are all rich people. But they have higher and lower education, and I can see an independent effect. And they are all very educated people. And there's an independent effect of income, right? So both of them have independent effects. They have a combined effect which is bigger. But they also have independent effects. People with the same level of education, the more income, the better connected. People with the same level of income, the more education, the better connected. So if I run multivariate analysis, which I did a lot some time ago, maybe 5 years ago, I was completely into that. You can run all these correlations, you can control for the confounders, and you can see which are the most important. What I found that basically what the most important is education and income. Age, important somewhat, the kind of jobs they have. Gender doesn't matter at all. Gender is a confounding variable. It's just because that women are poorer and less educated. They're discriminated in terms of income and education, and that leads them to have less ICT access. But being a woman itself is actually favorable. Women with the same level of education, same level of income, and same job use ICT more productively than men. So that's actually a confounding variable, we call that, right? And you can correlate that. You find different attributes. And the last one, the question is, of course, what does it mean to be connected? When are you on this, on that side of the divide? Is it enough to have access? Are you actively using it? And there are a lot of theories around that, of course. The media effects, of course, on this school, we studied a lot. What are the media effects? When does it have an effect on something? Here we have a usage indicator. There's not only access. And we can see that most people communicate. An increasingly number actually is interesting in developing countries. One of the first transactions that people make on the internet is with public authorities. For example, they pay their taxes online. That's the first time they dare to make an online transaction. That's kind of like the killer app. right? So e-government is the killer app. That's the one that opens the door, and then afterwards comes. In developed countries, it's different. Usually banking or Amazon are the first transactions that people make, right? And in developing countries, it's usually the other way around. And you can see, very interesting, if you start measuring kind of like the usage of the technology, which then, of course, leads to media effect studies, the impact of the technology, and that's the really interesting stuff. That's the stuff I'm also interested in, is then the impact of this technology in order to lead to social change. Now, I said this is now a question of who, with which attributes, connects how to what. And I can choose different things, different focuses of all of these combinations. For example, I track, let's say, 3 different kinds of subjects. Let's say this one researcher analyzed the digital divides in countries, among countries, the other one among companies, and the third one among individuals. The other researchers, one tracks income, the other one education, the other one urban-rural, and the fourth one age. The next researcher has differentiates between, one differentiates, oh, we are cool with access. No, people have to use the technology, or no, we have to show a media effect. We have to show an impact of the technology, however you might define that. And here also, one tracks mobile phones, one tracks internet. I would say track kilobits, that sums it up, but some might say 20 kilos is enough. No, 200 kilos is not enough. No, you need to have half a mega is not enough. So there, let's say we have 6 different definitions. So we already have 3 times 4 times 3 times 6. We have 216 different definitions of the digital divide. I just showed you 216 definitions that are different. And one of them will tell you the digital divide is closing. Can all go home. The other one will tell you the digital divide is widening. We are bad. And the third one will tell you, well, I think we are good, not bad. I think we have to try. And the truth is they're all right. All of them are right, just because they look at different things. So that's when I wrote this paper, because I got so bored sitting in these conferences, and you have always these contradictions. So this entire paper is just saying you are all right. You all have a point. You just look at different aspects of the same very well-known dynamic, which is the diffusion of innovation through social networks, right? Read your LU cuts, read your Everett Rogers. You will find all that stuff there. Okay, let's go. Let's take a food break, and then I have other things to talk about. Thanks. I can continue talking, so if you feel like at 1 o'clock you have to leave or something, that's absolutely fine. I do not get insulted at all. I have time until 1:45, I think, so I'm cool to stick around for another hour, and if you have time you want to talk about these things, we can. So what I talked about, like how to define the divide analytically, and I told you that's in the eye of the beholder, and that comes from the diffusion of innovation theory, right? And now the interesting question for policy is who defines the digital divide in practice? Now you go to all these conferences, you go to the governments, usually the telecom people have a very big role to play. Also in the UN, the World Summit on the Information Society was organized by our telecom department, the ITU, right? So these are engineers who basically run the show on global development. Now, of course, some people in education and in health and whatever, they say, you know, why the telecom engineers, right? What do they know about education? So what I then did is I looked at actually in practice who actually does policies in the world of ICT for development, but also in the United States. The United States also develops, right? Because it's all a moving target always. And if you do policies, what I found out over the years, and I think it's pretty straightforward, you see if you can look at what they say, and there's interesting analysis of all the policy documents, but the most that you find out if you see where the money is, right? They usually don't put the money where their mouth is, so you actually directly look at where the money is, you get a very good idea who does how much. In the United States, the FCC annually spends $8 billion on connectivity. It's a lot of money that they spend. Only the FCC, subsidies, socialism. They put broadband, $8 billion a year to the ones that are outside of the market reach, right? Now, the Recovery Act the Reinvestment and Recovery Act, the stimulus, Obama stimulus, right, gave an extra $7 billion on top. Not to the FCC, but to the NTIA. So during this time, they had around $15 billion in this year to spend on socialistic connectivity of the unfavored Americans. In total, however, the government spent $70 billion on ICT. So where is the rest of the money? I mean, that's a lot of more money. It is not with the telecom people. Well, it is dispersed between different secretaries, education and so forth, defense, of course, and others that also spend a lot on ICT and developments of ICT. So Obama put 3 people in charge to coordinate that. We have a federal chief information officer, or at least we had in the last administration, the chief performance officer, and the chief technology officer. And these 3 basically have job to coordinate all of this money and do a coherent ICT strategy here in the United States. It didn't really work out, of course, too well. What we usually find, what I found in developing countries, is if you really want to have this tightly coordinated, you have to take somebody from a very high hierarchy level inside the government. You have to take like a Biden, you know, a vice minister, a vice president. Because if somebody from a 4th hierarchy level calls for a meeting, probably Hillary Clinton won't show up. So, but if you have somebody very high, then you can say, okay, now we coordinate all this money that is dispersed and make sure there is no double effort. In Korea, you see the same thing, only a very small part, 15% of it in infrastructure, and they did great things with infrastructure. These are the guys who put the backbone down, right, and on top of that, they are one of the most connected country right now in the world, but only a small part of the ICT budget went into infrastructure development. A lot of other money went to other parts. In Chile, I have more detailed numbers. The telecom people spent $5 million. We're just a smaller country, in a poorer country. So the telecom people spent $5 million. However, the entire government spent in this year $200 million. Where did they spend the money? I had the data here in detail. The finance ministry spent a lot, especially for e-government services. Ministry of Education is the second spender. Ministry of Defense, the third. Ministry of Health spent a lot. Now, if you usually go to the policy documents, the health people are usually not so much in ICT 4D, but they should, and they do a lot in ICT 4D. A lot of the healthcare reform here in the United States is basically digitization of the healthcare systems. Most of the savings that are proposed in the Healthcare Act that was passed a couple of years ago are achieved through digitization. That's how this money is saved. So digitization between the hospitals, the pharmacies, and the insurance companies. Right? You get transparency in the efficiency, and so you can reduce costs a lot. So healthcare spends a lot, education spends a lot, and the telecom people, even though they have a lot to say, actually do not really spend as much, and that's important to keep in mind. So ICT development strategies are really multi-thematic. They touch everything. It's a social transformation. So 55%, more than half, is spent by these 3: finance, education, defense, and health. They spend 20 times more than the telecom people by themselves. So if you go back to the cube, you can of course put these numbers into the cube, and the cube somehow shapes and morphs in different shapes and sizes, right? So some policy area become bigger, some become smaller. You can see here, for example, that infrastructure in the Chilean case is 16% of the spending, generic service almost half of it, and capacity development some 20% of it. So you can see how the cube, you can play around with it, and it morphs and shapes in different shapes and sizes, right? Depending on which government, which country puts its emphasis into which kind of digital development strategy. So as a result, obviously, what I get from this is we have analytically a lot of possible definitions of the digital divide, and in practice, we realize that everybody is involved in working on this challenge. So how to define the digital divide and how to define digital development? Now, the best thing I came up with is that the end justifies the definition that I use. So conditioned on the impact that I look for, that's how I should define digital development. That's how I should define the digital divide. So the education people will define digital development differently than the health people, and differently than the telecom people. And that's good so. And if I looked also in this paper that I wrote, I looked at the impact that comes from it, and I found some very macro-scale evidence that yes, these countries who actually do not really push for a harmonized view. We all have to put on the same, but they do really messy projects, but they do projects. But the health people do theirs, and the education people do theirs, and the industry people do theirs. They push digitization much further than the others who get stuck in endless discussion on what is our... Digital development is as complex as all development because it touches all aspects, so it is messy. And I found that in these countries which actually have impact-driven definitions, you can achieve more. So given the desired impact, who, with which characteristics, connects how to what? Or normatively, given the desired impact, my impact, who with which characteristics should best be connected how to what? And I showed you there are many hundreds of different answers to that, and that depends on your conditioning variable, which is the impact that you have in mind, or the policymaker has in mind, right? And that I found that the most productive way to go about. So there's a paper written about that that just recently got published. All right, that's what I had to say about infrastructure, about the digital divide, about this part here. Let's go to this part here a little bit. Really the impact, the social change of it, right? I talked here about the diffusion of the innovation, which is quite important because it frames everything else. That's the basis. But now let's talk about the digitization, the social change itself, a little bit. What we usually can find when we digitize information and communication processes are some, I call them digital particularities. These are some things that are really, that's what digitization does to information and communication processes. One of them is, for example, the death of distance. There's this famous The Economist article written a couple of years ago, a decade ago, which is called The Death of Distance. My personal advisor, Manuel Castells, calls it the space of flows, which is, of course, a much deeper concept, but it refers to the same thing for our purposes right here, right? Distance is basically dying. What matters is not geographical distance in the digital realm, but it's actually a space of flows. So that's what matters. The geography doesn't matter, but what matters is a space in the network. Real-time communication, what Manuel calls timeless time. So it's this real-time communication that we can go with. Polydirectional networks. So they are not only one-directional networks, like we write a letter. They are not one-to-many, like I give a speech. They are not only many-to-one, like voting. They can be all of these and also many-to-many. So we call them polydirectional networks, and that's ICT can have all of these kind of network directions. They can be synchronous or asynchronous. I can either in real time blog, or I can asynchronically edit a Wikipedia article at 3 o'clock in the morning, and then the next morning somebody changes something again. So it can be asynchronous or synchronous, Skype conferences, right? I can work at the same time or time stagger. That makes a big difference. And digital networks, digital information allows that. That has a big potential to change many social processes in many applications. Network effects, very important. In the digital age, in industrial economics, we have the law of scarcity. If I eat an apple, and we two eat an apple, each of us get half. Now, if 3 of us eat an apple, we get a third of it, if we are fair. And the more people eat the apple, the less is for each one. In the digital age, the more people connect, the better it is to everybody. Economists have a horrible time with that, because one of the most fundamental laws of economics is suddenly upside down. If I'm the only one with a phone, it's horribly boring. If we have 2 people with a phone, Mr. Bell and Mr. Watson, he could already make 2 calls. If we have 3 people with a phone, we could already make 6 calls. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you have 4 people with a phone, we can already make 12 calls, right? So it's going up exponentially, x squared minus x, that's the network effects formula. By more people I have connected, the more benefit I get out. That's why Facebook is so valuable, because there's so many people. That's why people get logged in. That's why Twitter is so valuable. That's why you try to have a rich user base. It's not the software of Facebook, of course, that's worth as much $1 billion, right? It's the number of people, and then it grows exponentially, the value, boom, then you have it locked. And so network effects are in digital economics terribly important. The guy who kind of like worked a lot on this, Varian, he was an economics professor in the I school in Berkeley. He became the chief economist of Google right now. So he's the master behind, the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. And he was basically a digital scholar studying these kind of, he has a great book with Shapiro called Information Rules. So these lead to efficiency, these kind of digital particularities. So it means I need less and get the same output, or I need the same output, I get more out. Transparency, information, digital information always leaves a trace. That's a good thing. I can register it. Can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? But that's what it leads to, right? That's the effects. Or participation, I have an uplink. I don't only have a downlink, like in broadcasting, I have an uplink, so I can also participate and so forth. So these are some of the characteristics. So now we can study different aspects of social modernization, creative destruction, Schumpeterian creative destruction. For example, e-business. There's this great genius study from Jensen. Perfect. He was in Kerala in India, and he found this fisher village. And he knew that in a couple of months they're going to get cell phone connectivity. Until this point, they didn't have cell phone connectivity. He's an economist, so he went there, surveyed the entire village with everything. Then cell phones came, and a couple of years later, he came back and surveyed again. It's a perfect study design, right? You have a real, it's like an experiment in the real world. You have a real world village, but you have an experimental setup. You see the change, and what changed basically was that they had mobile phones, and he found incredible increases in productivity and everything that you want to call development. People were able, real-time communication, death of distance. While they were out at the sea, they communicated with the market and looked up on their phones what the market price is for what fish is. So they cut out the intermediary. They could optimize what they fish, knowing what the market price today is. They could optimize their income. They increased their income tremendously by just that. This information asymmetry was out of the way, right? They increased their income tremendously just with this. They also could communicate with each other, polydirectional networks. Once they were out there, they communicated and helped each other. So some said, hey, well, there are a lot of these kind of fish over here. Why don't you come here? You guys help me. So somebody cut it off over there, right? They could communicate in polydirectional ways. Before that, they just went out there. Half of them came back because I didn't find anything to do. Oh, yeah, I found more than I could handle. I don't, you know, that's how it was before. So with the cell phones, they could do these kind of things. Then also, not only it, they could increase their income tremendously. Also other aspects of development, health. For example, when a storm came up, they now knew that. Death rates and accident rates went down tremendously. That's an impact on development, right? Premature death is a typical characteristic of poverty. That is how poverty, you can define poverty. And they could reduce that, so their security was increased tremendously. Other things, of course. So, very good, very nice study. And they could do that through digital information flows, and that's basically e-business, right, for development. It's a very nice example for ICT for development. E-government is another application. We have these e-procurement sites, which had a very early, huge impact. This is one e-procurement site from Brazil. You can see that just by putting, a government has to buy a lot, right? They have to buy roads, they have to buy bridges, they have to buy airports, they have to buy also supplies for their schools. So before that, all these things what government bought was through paper, envelope-based competitions that were a little corrupt sometimes. So right now, you put all of that online. Brazil here, this is the state of Brazil, could reduce its cost by 25%. 25%. Cost reduction means 25% productivity increase. That's how it's defined, right? So that means you can increase for 25%. Well, actually, you couldn't grow. You have 25% more money left. So, and the economy, usually around the world on average, represents 20% of the economy. So the government represents 20% of the economy, 20% of GDP. So if I can really save a lot of money in how the government operates, I can get the economy to grow, right? I don't want to make it's very simplistic analogy, but you can kind of like think like that. Obviously, the government is more efficient. It can buy more roads. It can buy more airports. It can pay more teachers, and so forth. So this was a very important application. Not even talking about the transparency. We found amazing things. Some presidents in Latin America had towels in their office for $500. Now, you could see that now, because they bought all of this stuff online. They had no idea that it went on. Some journalist goes in there and finds that, right? And you say, well, why does this president spend $500 on 2 towels, right? But now it's before that we had no idea. So there are additional benefits on e-government and digitization for e-government besides increase in productivity. Now, as I said, there are many sectors. Here's a sector, entertainment. Bob Hornick that you have here in his, before he studied health, he studied that a lot. He has some very good milestone studies also on this, on using media for educational purposes and using, for example, soap operas for educational purposes. The impact studies, which Bob told me, are not always as good, but they show impressive results. For example, this is one, it was a radio show focused, not even digital at that point, focused on health. And you can see that this, the impact says that 96% of the people who listened to this show said that it influenced them to protect themselves against HIV/AIDS. 91% say it influenced them to use family planning. And 97% said that this show made them believe that having children when they weren't ready would be harmful. Things that before, family planning and so forth were difficult to communicate. Now you put that into a show, you make it entertaining, you present a lot of information, you show the dramatics that comes out, that affects people. So you can also use this edutainment, that's how they call it. It's another form of digital transformation for development. Of course, here's a very new example. One of my students right now is researching that, e-public diplomacy. And Hillary Clinton and the former administration set up a Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Activities. These are 12 people that are paid full-time to sit all day long in the Department of Defense, be on blogs of foreign countries, and just contribute and diffuse the idea of the State Department. So they speak Arabic, they speak Farsi, they speak whatever language you want. They are in these extremist blogs, just participate, and try to also, sometimes very openly, say, no, that is a lie. The United States Department does not say this. It says it. And actually, she gave them free hand. So the State Department actually doesn't oversee them. They have all the power to blog right now in real time, and the State Department trusts them. It's only 11 people, but it made a huge effect as well if they go full time on that. And at the end, Hillary Clinton said, we can tell that our efforts are starting to have an impact because we monitor the extremists venting their frustration and asking their supporters not to believe everything they read on the internet. So now the extremists say you shouldn't believe everything on the internet, right? Because it comes from official sources. So that shows you as well, that's that's cyber public diplomacy, e-public diplomacy. It's a way of doing diplomacy for the public in these blogs. And it has an effect, right? Right now, one of my students is studying that, and a very interesting area of application, of course. All right, so that was here. We could go endlessly on here. Usually also for most of students who study that, and first time also when I came into that, usually you study some kind of application. And there's an endless kind of application. In the course I teach, I usually leave it completely open for students to pick, and they pick great stuff I never thought about. I don't know, as I said, domestic violence or malnutrition or e-public diplomacy that I never really thought about. And you come up with great studies. I said it touches everything, right? So you can choose the topic you're interested in, and you can be sure that the ICT will be part of that nowadays. It surely is. So this is a big area. We could talk forever about these. But they all have, again, these digital particularities. Real-time communication, depth of distance, polydirectional networks, network effects. So you can always look for these kind of basic digital particularities, and you find like, oh, wow, that's how it's changing, right? That's the difference it makes. So let's go now on this last dimension. That's the policy. As I said, this is the necessary but not the sufficient. This leads to progress, but it doesn't lead to development. Development, you define it as you want. What's development for you? Is transparency, freedom of a press development or not? If you rank it this way or that way, some countries are more developed than others, or is it income the only variable for development, right? So you first of all have to define what is development for you, and then you socially construct according to this desired vision that your impact that you have. And that's a process of social construction. Now, when we do policies in the digital age, we are confronted with a couple of particularities as well, because digital policies are, especially in developing countries, I found it, you cannot usually use the usual, what you learn about public policy, because of these particularities you have here. Some of them come because it's digital, and some of them come because we deal with developing countries. So, for example, ICTs are general purpose technologies. As I said, unlike space technology, which is good for one thing, ICT touches everything, right? Everything can be partially digitized, all information communication flows. So I have a wide array of options, opportunities, also a wide array of threats, and a wide array of people I have to involve if I want to move to the digital age. Correct? Second of all, so when I do policies, when I as in the UN go to a country and give technical assistance, who's the authority? Where's the budget for ICT? I presented it a little bit. It's very dispersed. So when I go to a new country on a mission, I sometimes try to get first a feel of like, okay, who has how much to say? And usually, as I said, the people who talk most usually don't have the most money. So it's also important that you find out, you know, how can you move, how can you help this country to move forward? Second of all, technological progress in the digital age is exponential. It increases exponentially. Moore's law is exponential, right? I once estimated how information grows, not only the hardware capacity, but how far the information in the world grows and how much the communication capacity in the world grows. And it's tremendously exponential. Our storage capacity doubles every 3 years. That always means exponentially, it doubles, right? Hardware, we know, doubles every year and a half, Moore's law, every 18 months. So when I say it doubles every 2 years, I mean, what does doubling mean? People are horrible in understanding exponential progress because we always think linearly. We always think linearly. There's this one anecdote of the, I think it's the Emperor of China. It's of course an anecdote. It cannot be true. The Emperor of China was so impressed with the game of chess that he invited the guy who invented the game of chess to him. Of course, there's not one guy who invented the game of chess. It's an evolution over hundreds of years. But that's the anecdote, right? So he invited the guy to him who invented the game of chess. And he said, you know, I really love this game. I want to give you a gift. Choose whatever you want. He said, well, I'm very humble. I just want, you know, the chess set? I want 1 grain of rice on the first little square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, 8, 16, 32 grains of rice on the first day. That's all I want. You know, and then fill up. The emperor said, great. Perfect, you're such a humble guy. When they came to the end of the second one, it was like a little cup. When they came to the middle, it was a big sack. When they came a little bit further, it was a large storage. And on the last field of these 64 fields, you would have to cover the entire earth, land and ocean, with rice in order to produce the amount of rice that would have to go on the last field. Right? That's how exponential is. It starts very slowly, but man, does it pick up. There are 2 endings to the story. One is that the Emperor of China went bankrupt. I don't think that is historically true. The second is that the inventor of the chess lost his head. It's just more likely, but since we know there is no inventor of the chest, also that might not be true. But this is how exponential progress is. So Ray Kurzweil talks a lot about it. Of course, he's a futurist. He's not a scientist. We have to be very careful with what he tells us. But Ray Kurzweil has a lot of exponential. It's exponential. It's exponential. And that is true. Exponential technological progress. So the next 2, what does exponential mean? It doubles. When something doubles, when I'm at 4, it doubles to 8. Now it took a long time to get to 4. That means in the next doubling period, I will see the same amount of progress that I've seen until now since the beginning. And when I'm at 8, it goes to 16, and I will see the same amount of, in only 2 years, the entire amount. It might have taken a long time to get to 8, and the entire amount, I see that in the next 2 years. So when we say the digital age, for example, started in 1973, this is actually here we have a compatriota from Chile. This is from Chile, a cyber project from 1973. Didn't go very, very far. This is the first Xerox Palo Alto computer. That was 1973. Let's say, just for the sake of it, that's the beginning of the digital age, right? Then, 10 years later, we saw, well, the first backgammon. We still had MS-DOS, but the first Microsoft 101, first version of my Super Mario was already on the road, right? Then, 10 years later, we already had SimCity, Monkey Island, and Lara Croft was already around, right? And then again, 15 years later, Lara Croft looked much better, and we had all these funky applications. So, this is what it took until now. So in the next 2 years, you will see the same amount of progress. That's what exponential means. So if you're in 2012 now, you want to predict 2014, it would be the same amount of prediction you have to make when you were in 73 and you wanted to predict Facebook is worth $100 billion, and Twitter and whatever and cyber terrorism. And if you had predicted these things in 1973, you would be the same genius as if right now you predict what happens in 2 years. Because that's the amount of technological progress that we will see, right? That's exponential progress. So it is very difficult now if you do policies in a field like that. For a policy, 5 years is nothing. Because the first year you design it, the second year you have to gather support, the third year if you're lucky you start getting the resources, then you implement it, the fourth year and the fifth year maybe you see some impact and then you see, oh, did it work or not? Now if every 2 years it changes like that, I mean, how can you start to think about a policy? Right? I mean, that's just nuts. Okay, and, and that is something inherently digital that you have to face this amount of uncertainty. So what we did here, what I did a little bit here I will come back to that point. I also say there are a couple of particularities now to make things worse before I show you some of the solutions that we came up with. They're certainly imperfect. Is there also some particularities? That's because we deal with developing countries. We don't deal with the perfect scenario, right? In developing countries, technological progress is mainly exogenous. That means that these countries don't produce the technology. It falls kind of like manna from heaven for them, right? Here, you still produce the technology. In Europe, in ETSI, in the European Telecommunication Standard Institute, they sit together 10 years before a new telecom standard comes out, and they create it. The Nokia, the Ericssons, together with the governments, they created GSM, they created UMTS, and they created DVB, the digital TV standard television, and the digital TV standard, and they say, well, that's where we go, and they know where it goes. In developing countries, it's kind of like, oh, it falls upon us. Oh, that's great. If we don't, economically, it's a very big difference. There's endogenous growth model and an exogenous growth model, where technology is produced internally, and then it kind of like falls manna from heaven. That's a very different economic model of development. And that makes uncertainty only worse. Because now I cannot even, sometimes they say the best way to confront the future is to invent it. That might be true, but in developing countries you don't even invent it, right? So you have worse uncertainty already worse, and many developing countries are extremely heterogeneous. So geographically, income, education, in Latin America especially, it's the most unequal society in the world, and inequalities in developing countries are usually much more extreme. Think about China, the geography. Think about some former Soviet Union countries, right? How vast they are. Income inequalities, education inequalities. There is no social net that brings it to a basis, right? So you see an extreme heterogeneity that also makes it very complicated to work with. All right, so what to do about it? Now I presented you with all these problems to show you that it's basically impossible to do policies in a digital age. What to do about the uncertainty? The base thing I found when I researched different policy designs in the digital age is this kind of model, where you have a long-term vision, because that's important. Remember, if you don't know which port you're sailing to, you're never going to get there. So you have to, first of all, have a long-term vision. But since we know that the details of that will change dramatically all the time, it's important that in the policy implementation you have short-term action plans that you can constantly adjust. So what we did here in Latin America, there was the WSIS, I don't know if you know that, there was the World Summit on the Information Society. It went with the Millennium Development Goals. So a World Summit is when all head of states come together in the United Nations. And they all agreed on that we have a long-term vision. In 2015 we want, so the goals were 50% of our elementary schools of the world, that they have internet connections. Stuff like that, long-term goals, right? Now how to do that? You don't know which technology comes around in 10 years and so forth. So in Latin America, what we started to do is we had a short-term action plan, ELAC we called it. And we called it ELAC 2007. That was the first step from 2005 to 2007. Where we very humbly, with our governments, got together and said, in the next 2 years, that's the step we're going to make. We can also be much more concrete than on the global level. For example, the connecting the schools, we were pretty good, because Africa has much more problems with that. So we were more ambitious than others, and in others we had to work harder. We also put other points on the agenda that on the global agenda don't matter. And we went for the 2 years, one step. Then in 2007, we gathered all the countries again. We evaluated the old plan. We set up a new ministerial conference, and we developed ELAC 2010. Again, a new plan. right? We adjusted a lot of goals in between. And then in 2010, we met up all in Peru and started a new term action plan and to Lima, actually it's 2012, where governments now will meet, or met, I think, last month. Yes, no, they moved it to April. I'm sorry, the slide is old. So next April, they will meet in Lima and start to evaluate all of this and see, well, where did we get? How did we get with this long-term vision? And the short-term adjustment is the best you can do to constantly exchange it. So, for example, this was the ELAC 2007. It had 27 different goals: software, local governments, business, e-education, e-health, disaster management. Very important application for ICT, right? Universal access policy, legislative frameworks, public information and cultural patrimony. So different goals that the governments put in this action plan. At the UN, as a secretariat, we evaluated it. The green ones we did well, and the orange ones we did somehow, and the red ones we did bad. And the red ones we did bad, and the white ones we did best. Exactly, the green ones we did well, and the white ones we did best. So we evaluated with a lot of statistics. That what do? You go out, you measure, you write the reports, you do research, you inform the governments how they did. You do a little bit of naming and shaming. Always works, not too harsh, right? Because you want to motivate them as well. And confront them with this, right? And then they say, well, okay, that's how we did with this. And now we have to evaluate the entire policy options again in light of the new developments. 2 years, 3 years have passed. So this action plan, the ELAC 2007, basically how it came to being, I just sat on my computer and wrote it down. And we circulated it with the governments. They discussed it, and they changed some things, and they approved it. I wasn't very happy with that, because I understood that I don't have all the knowledge, especially all this uncertainty and all this heterogeneity. It was impossible for me to include all. My boss just said that write something, we have to circulate it, right? So that's what I did. So in the next time, 2 years later, what we did is we set up a participatory process. So we opened this entire thing up and said, based on this action plan, on the old one, we have to resign it, we have to adjust it. So please, everybody come. Of course, we do that through ICT. We set up an interactive platform where specialists from all fields, government, private sector, civil society, universities, could come in and contribute to help us redesign this action plan. A lot of people participated, 1,500, much better than I ever could do. You can see evenly distributed, private sector many, academia also a quarter, civil society, public sector as well. Many of them were very educated. 2/3 of them had at least a graduate education. And we included many different also organizations around the region, which is important, right? You want to get them in, want to get their input, and want to get their support. First of all, it gives you a much better action plan. And second of all, you have much more commitment, because now the stakeholders themselves designed it, right? It gives you a policy agenda with much more commitment from the beginning. It's not something that's pressed onto them, but something they can shape themselves. So this was called, was the biggest online participatory policy making exercise in the developing countries. We fed that then into the intergovernmental mechanism, which is important to get the legitimacy. The ministers, secretaries discussed it, tweaked something, approved it, and became the new action plan. Now, if I compare the new and the old action plan, some things changed, as I said. Environment moves on, right? These 7, there were 30, as we saw, 30 thematic areas. These 7 lost importance, and these were some new areas of importance that people put in. So, for example, you can see also some of them evolved. For example, in 2004, 2005, we thought free and open source software is so important. 2 years later, they said, no, actually, what matters to us is intellectual property. And it's a learning process, right? Also here we said alternative new technologies. And 3 years later, it was like, no, let's just study Skype. Skype makes a big problem, let's just study that. So you have a learning process. Great that we had this chance. We readjusted, we got it much more concrete, right? And stakeholders are more committed then as well to continue working on that. I published that in a study as well. We see that actually only a quarter of the goals in only 2 years, imagine, only 2 years of policy agenda, only a quarter of the goals are exactly still the same, very, very similar. A quarter of the goals are completely new, and half of the goals were adjusted. It's just that we have to update it. And that's what's important, because if we would have stayed with the old policies agenda, usually a 5 or 6 or 7 years. Now, if you, in the digital age, 5 years, after 2 years, at least a quarter of them is completely obsolete, is nonsense. So you better drop it. I mean, we don't have a crystal ball. We're going to make mistakes. This stuff goes too fast. So we rather just go after 2 years, evaluate it, and what doesn't work, drop it. And what's good, keep it, and what needs adjustment, adjust it. But that's still better than, you know, stubbornly trying to implement an obsolete policy agenda, right? So you got to recognize your limitations and adjust it. So that was very interesting that we actually saw here that there was an evolution in the policy goals. So going back now to my particularities, what can we do? And that's just one policy design option if you think about policies in the digital age, is ICT, a general purpose technology, as I said. So what can you do? You need a decentralized approach. That's why we opened it up, right? 1,500 people, they're education experts, health experts, civil society experts, you know, let's bring them all in. It touches everything, so we need the expertise of everybody. That's one of the conclusions what you can do, open it up. Second of all, there's exponential technological progress. So what you do is you involve a large number of people of institutions, you set up a flexible short-term structure to complement a long-term vision. That's how you can confront this uncertainty, and you have to have a close monitoring mechanism. We were lucky we had the funds at the UN to be able to do that. Not all policy projects even have the funds to closely monitor it. Digital policies you always have to monitor very closely, just because they change so drastically in such a short time. Technological progress is exogenous, so what do you do? Cooperate internationally. We had strong partners in Canada and in the European Union who helped us, you know, also to understand technological progress a little bit better. Also within Latin America, some countries are more advanced than others, right? Brazil has an ICT sector, other countries don't. So it's important to cooperate there. And many developing countries are extremely heterogeneous, so what you have to do is you have to recognize that, of course, there's not one size-fits-all strategy. What you have, if I go back to my cubes, actually, you have kind of like this Matryoshka approach, right? You have kind of like the cubes inside the cubes. So you have here the global agenda, here the Latin American agenda, here you have the Chilean agenda, then you have the agenda of southern and northern Chile, you have the municipality, you have every enterprise, every hospital, every university has its own digital agenda of modernization, right? So it's more like but you still have this the same logic. You always need infrastructure, capabilities, digitization, strategy to guide it, right? So it's all the same, but it's kind of like strategies inside strategies. And the more you get concrete, the more specific you can be, of course. The more to a lower level, the more specific you can be. On the global level, when we were negotiating the World Summit of the Information Society, well, what is important for Africa is not important to Japan. So you have to find goals that are kind of like, well, but some things are important to us, you know. So you can have to be much more vague. The more concrete you get, the more you can also design policies that are really, really hands-on. Doesn't say that they're more or less important. They're just different levels of abstraction. All right, I guess that closes it. What I told you is a theoretical framework. I talked a little bit about that. Schumpeterian, as I said, innovation theory is a very important subject. The social construction of the creative destruction of the innovation process is very important. How to define the digital divide. I talked about who with which attributes connects how to what, and I said at the end that what matters is the impact. So based on the impact that you desired, that justifies which definition you have of the divide or of development, right? I talked a little bit about digital innovations and applications. I told you about the fishermen in Kerala, the e-public diplomacy, counterterrorism, and there's a lot of very cool applications out there that one can study, and policy strategies in the digital age at the end. And I said there's a lot of uncertainty there that you have to confront. And we reviewed some of the options, what you can do. Short-term adjustments and decentralized approaches work quite well, but of course there are no panacea. You often still mess up with a considerable amount of your efforts, but it's better than doing nothing because, as I said, the digital age is socially constructed, and it can go also very bad. The oldest division of the information society was not by a scholar, but by a novelist, by George Orwell, in 1948. He wrote a very detailed vision of the information society. It was not a pretty one, all right, the one of 1984. So you have to guide it, of course. So you need policy, strategy, and social construction. All right, that's it. If you have more questions, I'm very happy. Thanks for staying here so long. Thanks for having me.